Welcome to the recording for Green Design and Technology Week 8. You can see that Week 8 goes from May 20th to 26th. And as my note says here, obviously we're getting near the end of the course. No revision on any work after May 31st. So if I pull up a calendar, take a look at this. May 31st is 2 weeks from now. It's a Friday. Anything turning after midnight that day for like these next 4 days, you cannot get revisions on that. So I suggest you get work turned in early. So for this week, we're looking at green agriculture. That's section 5. And of course, you're going to do the Class Connect write-up. And you see all the topics about green agriculture. We're looking at agriculture and aquaculture, property rights and sustainability, organic products, local agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So look at all of those topics. Then, of course, you have the study questions that you do for each week, your quiz, and I give you the quiz preview, of course, and then finally you have your assignment for the week. So that's what we have for the Section 5 work in Green Design and Technology class. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and of course you have week 9, which is next week, and then the final week where you want to turn in all this stuff. So getting down to the end of it, remember you want to shoot for 600 points. Once you get to 600 points, that means you're guaranteed to pass. If you have other classes that are more important, like your core classes, math, English, etc., do those, work on those to get those grades higher. But once you get this one to 600, don't worry about doing any more until your other classes are high enough where you want them. Then come back and do this one since this is an elective. All right, here we are in Section 5. When we go to Section 5, look at the Week 8 Class Connect write-up. This is kind of a long unit, but so I'll go through it relatively quickly. But in Lesson 1, we're going to look at the 4 steps for agricultural process, 2 main drawbacks for not using crop rotation, why feedlot livestock is cheaper than in the market than grass-fed, like when you go to the store, and finally, what is the environmental concern of open ocean aquaculture. So hopefully I'll remember all that stuff. So jumping into Section 5. And Section 5 again is all about green agriculture, crop and livestock production, aquaculture, property rights, genetically modified organisms, organic products, etc. This is all of Section 5. But for today, we're just going to be covering probably about 3 of these items. Or for this lesson, I mean Lesson 1. So Lesson 1, agriculture and aquaculture. As you look at it, agriculture is the production of crops and livestock, and you know what crops and livestock are, right? So you can see all the information about those. That's agriculture. In the whole agriculture process, there are 4 steps. There's a production, which is the raising of the products, the processing, which once they're produced, how do you harvest them, and what do you do as you go through that to get them ready for delivery? So then delivery would be when they go to the market. Then finally the marketing. So you'll need to read through those 4 things, but those are the 4 steps in the agricultural process. So do this drag and drop activity, see what you know. Then crop production. So 2 parts of agriculture, livestock and then crops. This is talking about crops. And annual cultivation is a crop that, 1 crop per year, like corn. Here in the western Colorado, they grow lots of corn, or soybeans and things like that. In the San Luis Valley, they grow lots of potatoes. Those are annual crops. They grow one time, grow over the course of a year. So you can see the winters are too cold to grow, so obviously they grow in the spring and the summer. Then there's different types of growing. You can have crop rotation. That's when crops are planted in different planting cycles. And crop rotation, it helps build up soils, so the soils are really good. So soybeans are rotated with corn in some places like the South where they can grow stuff year-round, because soybeans put a lot of nitrogen that corn can use. So crop rotation is really important. And if you have crop rotation, you don't have to use so much fertilizer. So you see down here, fertilizer puts nutrients in the soil, but fertilizer also bad for people. So crop rotation can control insects, and it can also make the soil stronger. So crop rotation is really important. Lots of places they don't do that. Multiple cropping, that's where you put different crops together. So you could put one crop grow on the same land at the same time, or it could be grown at different times, like alfalfa and corn. They can kind of grow in the same time. So you have multiple cropping and intercropping. Then shifting cultivation is where production that involves cutting and burning of forests or fields. And what they do there, they would burn it down, burn the field, burn the crop after they harvest it. Then they let the land sit for a while, let it sit fallow. Then it builds up some, more energy, the soil builds up, and then they can start using it again. So those are different types of crop production through that drag and drop activity. And then livestock. Of course, livestock, we're talking about usually meat and dairy products. So you have pigs, cows, those types of things. And of course, with livestock, the byproducts, the manure can be used for fertilizer. Some livestock can be used for fabrics and clothing. So you can see the skin for cows is used for leather. Wool from sheep can be used for lots of different things. So it's more than just meat. There are lots of things that livestock can be used for. Different types of livestock. A farm with livestock on it is animal feeding operations. Obviously, they need to feed the animals, and some of these feeding operations, they have breeding programs to raise more, and obviously they have feeding programs to bring up the animals that they have. So you can read down through that about all this, talk about antibiotics used on animals so that there's no diseases, and they really have to be careful with that, because sometimes in these feeding operations there's so many animals that the natural bacteria can overcome those animals. So they use lots of inoculations and antibiotics. And could that affect the food? Well, it possibly could. A lot of people don't want to have their cows with lots of inoculations and antibiotics in it. Now, feedlots. Feedlots are, you've maybe seen them in some places around Colorado. You can see feedlots, particularly out around Greeley. They have some around Fruita, down around Pueblo, but feedlots where they have all these animals, they're concentrated. They have all these animals in big enclosures, and they feed them out of these troughs. So they're almost entirely fed from feed, which is usually grass or corn or soybeans and different things like that. Now, the thing about that is that from these feedlots, there's so much waste. And they use a lot of the manure, can be sold for fertilizer, which is good, but a lot of that waste can also be damaging to our ecosystem, especially if that waste leaches in through the soil and down into the water table. That can be bad. So feedlot animals also sometimes have hormones, so they grow faster. Meat and dairy products that come from feedlots are usually cheaper than products from grass-fed livestock because it's easier to feed and maintain animals in a feedlot. So if you had 1,000 cows in a feedlot in a tight fenced-in area, it's a lot easier to just drop them off some hay and corn and let them eat. But imagine if you had 1,000 cows in an area of 200 acres where they're eating natural grass. Well, that would be very expensive to maintain, right? So that's the reason that feedlot animals are usually less expensive than free-fed animals, or animals that can feed on their own. Growth hormones. Those are used a lot to make animals grow faster so then they can go to market. If a farmer or a cattleman or rancher can have a cow that can be ready for the market in 6 months through hormones, that's much better than if he has to wait 12 months for the natural process. But we worry about hormones being in animals because what happens, a lot of times the residue from hormones get into the meat and the milk, and then that could possibly affect humans when they consume it. So there's really some things that are really bad about feedlots and growing livestock and different things like that. Really, I don't do. I eat meat, so I'm just as much to blame as everyone else. But if we all were vegetarians, it would be really beneficial to our ecosystems and our environment. Now, aquaculture. Aquaculture is farming fish, underwater plants, or other organisms like shrimp and lobster and things like that. for human consumption. Sometimes they're used in ponds and things like this. Sometimes they might have cages out in the natural environment. They have, when they farm salmon, they have these giant gated, fenced-in enclosures out in the actual ocean, and the salmon live in those enclosures. They can't get out of them, and then they harvest the salmon right from there. So there are many different ways that aquaculture can be done. So aquaculture production, so feeding underwater organisms, you feed them in a pond or a tank or something like that, and you have to use antibiotics and pesticides to keep them healthy and to keep bugs away and parasites and fungus. Well, of course, the animals suck those things down, and that might then get into their meat, the stuff that we eat. So that's not good, is it? Open ocean aquaculture. Open ocean aquaculture has special environmental concerns because waste created by the fish or other organisms can pollute the ocean. So just like I was talking about, if you have salmon or another type of fish that are in these giant cages, and these cages can be like 400 or 500 feet on each side. So these giant cages, and the salmon feed in there. Imagine all the waste and manure that those salmon drop. It's probably really damaging to the natural ecosystem where those cages are, isn't it? What they try to do is mix them up. Multi-tropic aquaculture, where they might have shellfish and fin fish like salmon in the same area, and then they feed off of each other's wastes. So do this practice about aquaculture. So the summary of lesson 1, we learned about all these things: agricultural process, crop production, livestock, and aquaculture. So now we move into lesson 2, and we'll go back to the write-up, see if I answered those questions. 4 steps for that process. You did that. 2 main drawbacks to not using crop rotation. We talked about that. Why is feedlot usually different than grass-fed livestock? What is one environmental concern about open ocean aquaculture? Talked about that. Okay, lesson 2, example of how business property rights can be affected by the government. I have a misspelling there, so I'm going to go ahead and fix it while I'm here. Property rights. There, got that fixed. So again, example of how business property rights can be affected by the government. How are farmers affected by water use laws? And why do scientists want to develop genetically modified organisms? Oh, I'm going to go that way. So now we're going to go into lesson 2. Come on. Okay, let's move forward here to lesson 2. Okay, lesson 2, property rights. So property is anything you can own. Of course, we're talking here about property and owning it and being able to do whatever you want to with it. So property rights are rights that include the use of the property, the right to make money off the property, the right to transfer the property, etc. So we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about farmers and people that own the property that they then produce to make a living. Now, just because you own something doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to with it. Down here, what you can do with your property is often regulated by the government. For instance, somebody builds a house, it has to be built a safe way so it doesn't fall down. Also, it might have to be built a certain number of feet away from the property line so it doesn't affect the next person. On a farm, you might be able to only have 100 cows per acre rather than 200 cows per acre. So just because you have property and have the rights to that does not mean that you can do whatever you want to with it. Those are a couple of examples of what the government can do to affect your property rights. Do that practice, see what you know. Sustainability and property rights. So property rights give people the use of the property, do whatever they want, but then some government laws can pass that limit the uses of the property. For instance, here in Grand Junction, where I live downtown, even though I own this property, I would not be able to put in a factory or a trash collection business because I'm in a neighborhood. So the government can limit what I can do. Owners of feedlots can't dispose of the animal waste in any way they want to. They have to follow government regulations to do that. So you can see that the government tries to step in to make things equitable for everyone and safe for people. Then there are water use laws. We all use water for drinking, for eating, for bathing, toileting, all of those types of things. And of course, the rivers and lakes, most are publicly owned. That means that the government essentially controls them. That's the above ground water, but then we have groundwater. Groundwater is the water that is underground, and lots of times the people who own the property own the groundwater, but sometimes other people own the groundwater rights. It just depends on where you live and what rights you have as far as ownership. Now, some of the things about groundwater laws, they don't affect people who live in cities and towns because we buy our water from our municipal water system, like here in Grand Junction with the City of Grand Junction water system. That's where I get my water. But people who live on farms, they're affected by water laws because their water comes from the ground. Or even come from rivers. So if there are laws on the use of water, groundwater and even river water, those people that own those properties, they get affected by rules that the government makes about water. For instance, Colorado River that runs through most of Colorado, and even the Rio Grande that runs through southern Colorado, they end up in other states and in other countries, end up in Mexico. Well, Colorado River water, the City of Las Vegas has a right to a certain amount of feet of Colorado River water every year. So that takes it away from our farmers here in Colorado. Say with Rio Grande, there's certain rules that a certain amount of water has to get into Texas through the Rio Grande River. So that means people that live up around Creede and San Luis Valley, Alamosa, they don't have all the rights to whatever water they have that flows in those rivers. Even if you have property that's on those rivers and you can fish right on those rivers, you cannot take water off of those rivers. By law, you can't take it unless you have the right to it as a farmer or a rancher. Irrigation, that is, moving the water to where you want it to be. So of course it can be used in canals, in pipes. It can be, used as a sprinkler system. And of course, irrigation is the way that you get water to water crops when water isn't there naturally. If you ever get to fly over southern Colorado around Alamosa and that area, the San Luis Valley, you can see the giant sprinklers that are like, it's 1,000 feet long sometimes. And they're on big wheels. And you can see these out in the plains too. And those, the flat plains out in eastern Colorado. And you see those are called center pivot irrigation system. It's just like this pivot, this sprinkler goes around in a circle. So they have the circles of crops. So there are sprinklers, there's localized irrigation like drip irrigation like you might have in your garden or your home. Then surface irrigation. That's mean where you would have it terraced or you would have canals that feed the water. Where I live in Grand Junction, this is a huge grape growing area, and they make wine and things like that. Most of the water is from irrigation from the Colorado River, way out by Parachute, and then it gets put in a canal and flows downstream into Grand Junction area. Water use, measuring. Of course, most houses have water meters so people can see how much water you use, and then you get charged per the water that you use. And you see this talks about other ones called flow meters because it checks the flow of the water. Then open channel meters, they measure like the open channels or canals that farmers might use. So there are many different types of meters, but for most of us, the water meter out by the curb in our yard is how we figure our water use. If you live in an apartment, then of course the landlord of the apartment gets charged for all the water that the tenants use. And then the landlord might charge you or might not charge you. Different types of water. Okay, there's wastewater, is water that has been used already. So like this says, clean your dishes, wash your clothes, flush down the toilet, take a shower, or whatever. And there are two different types of wastewater. There's gray water. Gray water is stuff that comes out of the shower or the bathtub. When you wash your dishes, things that flow through your sinks. Black water are things that flow through your toilet. And a lot of times they're kept separate through different piping as they go into the water treatment center. Here in Colorado, they're not separate. They all go together. Some places that have them separate, there's a lot less work that you have to do on gray water to make it usable again, but on black water, there's a lot more use that the systems have to do. So wastewater management is a huge business. And you can see around your city, you'll probably find something like this. All the water comes in, there are ponds where it all settles out, and some of those are pretty, they used to be pretty gross looking. Now they're a lot cleaner than they used to be. You even see birds in them sometimes. And once the water gets in there, then all the heavy stuff, the particulates settle down, and then the water on top flows out, and that gets clean and can be reused again for crops, can be clean and then flow back into the rivers. So there are lots of ways that water can be reused after it's been wastewater. Fertilizer is added to plants or soil to make them grow better. Of course, the main reason you use fertilizer is so things will grow faster, and then farmers can grow more crops. So that's really the main use of fertilizer. Of course, in your yard, you use fertilizer. Your mom and dad might use fertilizer for flowers to make them grow better. Then, of course, there are pesticides. And pesticides are used in agriculture and aquaculture to keep pests away, to kill bugs that might eat part of the crop. Of course, the thing with this, as soon as those bugs get those pesticides, what happens when birds eat those bugs? Then the birds get those pesticides, right? And what happens when those pesticides are sprayed on a corn crop and then we eat the corn? Well, if we don't clean it well enough, we could eat those pesticides. Corn is covered, so that's not bad, but what about like an apple? An apple where you eat the outside part of the apple? One of the worst things with pesticides are potatoes. You should never eat the skin of a potato unless it's been extremely well washed. Even then, you might not want to eat the skin of a potato, but potatoes have lots of insecticides, and they could be somewhat poisonous to some people. Genetically modified. We know what genes are, genetics. That's how our bodies are formed. That's the code within every living organism. Well, what researchers scientists are doing, is they're trying to do genetically modified organisms. Those are ones that have had their genes altered or changed. And the reason they want to do this is to try to create better agriculture and aquaculture products. So imagine if they could make a cow that could have its genes altered, and that cow could live off of, let's say, maybe that cow could live off of 10 pounds of grass a week rather than currently 50 pounds of grass. Wouldn't that be a great thing to have for farmers? Yes, it would. So there are different ways that scientists are trying to make better animals and plants. Is it good? Who knows? People are really afraid of altering genes. Now, some of the benefits of altering genes, you can read through this, is that you can make a species, like a species of corn or a type of corn that wouldn't be affected by certain types of bugs. That would be good. Imagine if you had tomato plants that as soon as tomato worms bit the leaves, the tomato plants had a chemical in them that would kill those bugs automatically. Wouldn't that be amazing? So there are many different reasons that scientists are trying to do this. Disadvantages, obviously, is that they think that some of this could be harm to humans. So you can read about that. Also, that biodiversity damage. I mean, if you start genetically modifying crops and you only grow that one type of crop, what if some insect came in that could actually eat that crop? So there are many different ways that many people are worried about the genetically modifying thing. So you can look at all the information about genetically modifying resources. GMO property. So the genetic code within a genetic modified is the property. That's the property of that species. So like flowers, they have certain genetic code, and when they pollinate, then that genetic code is transferred from one crop to another. But as people start developing these genetic codes, it ends up being property with ownership. So then you have, somebody that might have genetically modified plant and it cross-pollinates with ones that's not genetically modified. So, who owns the rights and things like that. So it's really getting kind of tricky when you start talking about those types of things. Genetically modified labeling, our government, our health and safety people are starting to make sure things have to be labeled properly. As of right now, there's no labeling of genetically modified, but many people want that to happen. So you would know. So in lesson 2, we learn about all of those things. All right, moving on, lesson 3, let's go to the write-up. So lesson 2, example of business property rights, we did that. How are farmers affected by water use? We talked about that. Why do scientists want to develop genetically modified? We talked about that. Example of an organic farm practice that might make organic food more expensive. A couple ways you can support local small farms. Okay. Organic products. Organic means that something was grown without synthetic materials, meaning without chemicals. That's essentially what we talk about when we talk about organic. And that means also that it's clean, right? So organics, they have no fertilizers, no synthesized products or anything like that. So they just grow naturally. Plants are that way, but also some livestock can be that way. And a lot of people like that because you don't have those chemicals and just eating the natural product. Now the thing about the genetic, as you start to read some of this information, is that they end up costing, generally they cost a lot more. The organic does. So if you think of organic, here's a farmer out in the field. If it's organic, the farmer has to remove the weeds by hand rather than use herbicides or sprays. Also, the farmer has to go out and get the bugs out of there by hand or use a natural way to kill the bugs, like bringing in bugs that eat other bugs, like ladybugs, they eat other bugs. So farmers can do that. But farmers in organic farms, they have to really be, it's much more labor intensive. Right down here, organic products cost more because the extra labor that goes into producing them. For instance, if I have an apple tree and I use no chemicals, it's all organic, bugs might eat 25% or 1/4 of all my apples each year. But if I could have pesticides, then bugs would eat none of my apples. Then I could have 100%. So if I can only get 75% of my apples because bugs eat 25%, then I'm going to have to charge a little bit more for my product. So you can see why some organic products are going to cost a little bit more than other products, non-organic. And the impacts, you read the impacts about this, what organic farms, the positive impacts of organic farms. Healthier soil. They use less energy because they don't have machines generally that are going to be spraying the pesticides and things like that. They may also produce less waste. So there are lots of positive things with organic products. So do this practice activity. Organic certifications, you've probably seen these at the stores. You might want to go in, if you get a chance, go into Whole Foods Market or Sprouts, those types of high-end markets, and see how much organic stuff they have. Probably a lot more organic stuff than you'd have at Kroger or City Market or Safeway. Small farms. Small farms are really important to our country because so many people are employed by small farms. But small farms, really 180 acres, so pretty small, to a farm with 250,000 worth of products each year, usually owned by a farmer instead of a big company. The farmer's family might work on the farm. Some of you might even live on the farm or the small ranches, and you probably know some of this information. Now, if you think about small farms, there are advantages over large ones. Large ones usually only grow one top. Small farms usually grow lots of stuff. Small farms don't have so much machinery and pesticides usually. Small farmers can manage their crops better than large farms can. So lots of different things about small farms that are really positive. Less waste, less fossil fuel use, less fertilizer. So small farms are much better for our environment than large farms. Also about small farms, they usually sell their stuff close by, whereas large farms, they ship their stuff hundreds or thousands of miles away. Now some things that you can do, let's see if it shows it on this slide, things you can do to support small farmers. I mean, what could you do to support small farmers? Well, imagine if you bought from small farmers at your local farmers market during the summer. Or imagine if you ate at restaurants that bought their stuff from local small farmers. Those are some things that you can do to help small farmers. So this talks more about the economics of small farms. So again, supporting small farms. Buy local. So try to buy things, your produce and groceries and such, try to buy things that are produced nearby. That can really help the small farmers. Support small farmers at farmers markets. Eat at restaurants, right? This talk about restaurants that use local ingredients. Eat at those types of places. So there's some things you can do to support small farmers. And small farmers, they belong to cooperatives, which are a bunch of small farmers that work together. So if you can shop at those food cooperatives like that, that can really support small farmers, which is good for our economy, good for our environment. Then let's talk a little bit about fair trade. So fair trade is that where grocers paid a fair amount for the products while promoting sustainability. So when you talk about fair trade, what we're talking about is sustainability practices, and those are really important in places like South America where they grow a lot of coffee, bananas, chocolate, and things like that. It used to be that those people would just decimate the environment, but now there are some regulations on how they can raise their coffee, teas, and bananas. So it's a lot different, it's much more sustainable than it used to be. Practice activity for you. And finally, gardening. Of course, you might have your own garden or a community garden. Here in Grand Junction, we have a couple of community gardens, which are big vacant lots that people can go and they can buy a section of it. They can grow their own crops. Sometimes people just go in and everybody raises a garden together. And everybody shares through that. Some alternatives to those types of things: aquaponics, grow without soil, you grow things in water. You add liquid nutrients to it. Window farms, you can see this little picture over here. You can grow tomatoes and strawberries like this. Rooftop gardens. I mean, we waste a lot of space on our rooftops, don't we? Why don't we put gardens up there? Some schools have rooftop gardens. So summary, we looked at organic products, small farms, and different types of gardens. Okay, number 4, let's go to the write-up. Number 4, what are 4 reasons many people want to change agricultural practices to be more sustainable? Give an example of an integrated system in farming practices. So hang in, I know this is a long one. So this is all talking about the industry, agricultural industry, and industrialization changed our economics, and that provided ways, more mechanisms and equipment, things like that, provided ways for our farmers and to be much more productive, and for us to be more productive as citizens. So that's why we have large farms, because industrialized agriculture, you can see all the giant equipment that these industrialized agriculture, these giant farmers use. The impact of large farms. So this all talks about the impact of large farms. And you can see the 4 things that large farms, the agricultural impact, and this is because industrialized agriculture, the impact it has, well, it has an impact on the crop production, on livestock, fossil fuel dependence, and on aquaculture. Let me go back to the write-up, make sure. 4 reasons many people want to change agricultural. No, we haven't gotten to that yet. Okay. But you can read here about how the impact of agriculture. Livestock. Agricultural impact of livestock. So again, talking about feedlots. Also the fact that grain-fed livestock It has fewer omega acids, so there are many different reasons that you might want to use sustainably grown foods. Fossil fuels. Fossil fuels power the machinery on these giant farms. Little farms use them too, but sometimes they produce their own fertilizer, use natural pesticides, etc. Big farms don't do that. And finally, aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture. They use antibiotics, growth hormones, and herbicides, and those can be found in the meat of the fish that we eat. Well, it may not be very good for us, right? Also, look down here in Central America, they've chopped up the mangrove orchards, the natural mangrove orchards, and they turn them into shrimp farms. So that disrupts the ecosystem. Now, looking towards sustainability. Of course, sustainability in agriculture, we want to be able to grow things so that they don't affect the environment so much. So some of the 4 things about sustainable: better crop production, better livestock production, better aquaculture, increased local agriculture. So read down through these, and just remember just some of the ideas behind these types of practices and some of the stuff that we've learned about. Better livestock production. Grass-fed livestock is better than grain-fed livestock. Grass-fed livestock can naturally fertilize the land. Meat from grass-fed is usually better than meat from grain-fed. Better agricultural products. Sustainable agriculture to make sure the waste from the fish can be used in some way. Food for algae. You can grow algae and then you can make oil from algae, and the oil is biodiesel that can be used in automobiles. So sustainable aquaculture, it doesn't make use of hormones, pesticides, or antibiotics. So that's really a great way to do aquaculture. And of course, increase local. We talked about that. Buying local products, growing your own garden, joining a cooperative or a gardening group. Many different things you can do there for sustainable agriculture. Now, integrated biological systems. This is kind of an interesting concept. This is first I've heard of this, but it's really interesting if you could have, the output from cows, which is methane gas, go into the biofuel process, or even the cow patties they leave can be burned as biofuel. Wouldn't that be great that you could use that organic waste as biofuel? So you have a whole system set up to produce energy, not only produce food, but energy for man to use. So we looked at the environmental impact of agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and integrated biological systems. Let's go back to the write-up. 4 reasons why people want to change the agricultural process to be more sustainable. Example of integrated systems and farming practices. We looked at that. And finally, the career connection. You look at Ryan Goldsmith, what he does in his job, what is his typical day like, what education did he need, and other important information. So that's all for this week. So again, I look forward to your work coming in. We're getting towards the end, so you really need to catch up. Remember, your goal is to get to 600 points. Once you get to 600 points, that means you're guaranteed to pass the class. So work hard to get to 600. Okay, look forward to your work, everybody. Bye.